and welcome to Deschutes Public Library's online programming. I'm Liz Goodrich, and I'm part of the community relations team that has been busily at work keeping customers connected to the library and the resources we have to offer remotely during the COVID-19 pandemic. For more information about what the library has to offer remotely at this time, please check out our website, www.deschuteslibrary.org. We find ourselves in unfamiliar and uncertain times, but as our presenter today is here to remind us, we have been here before, and I'd like to introduce Kelly Cannon Miller. She is the Executive Director for the Deschutes County Historical Society, which operates the Deschutes Historical Museum in downtown Bend. She's a graduate of Portland State University with an MA in History. She currently serves on the editorial board of the Oregon Encyclopedia and is a member of the Deschutes Cultural Coalition and writes for both the Oregon Encyclopedia and the Oregon Historical Quarterly. She's the daughter of an archaeologist, and she spent parts of her childhood in the deserts of southeastern Oregon cataloging rock art and in the back rooms of regional universities and museums. Please welcome Kelly. I'll let you take it from here.
Thanks, Liz. Let me see about getting my screen up here for everybody. I joked the other day that past pandemics have made historians just the people of the hour that everyone wants to talk about past pandemics and how it all compares. And particularly the 1918 flu kind of stands out for everybody. And with good reason. It was the last great pandemic that really shaped human history. So in the scope of centuries, few things like disease have shaped the course of human evolution more. When you think about colonization and smallpox hitting the Americas, disease made conquering the Americas possible. Disease ended wars. Disease has started wars. It's just been ever present in human history and wreaking havoc wherever it goes. So let's talk about specifically when the flu of 1918 and 1919 came to Bend. First, a little bit just about what life was like then in terms of health and medicine. The average life expectancy in 1918 for men was 53 years old. For women, it was 54 years old. So we're talking, a radically different life expectancy for people than we have today in 2020. Medical help back in 1918, depending on where you were in the country, if you were rural or urban, medical help could come from a doctor, it could come from a druggist or your pharmacist, it could come from a veterinarian, it could be folk remedies, or you could be lucky enough to live somewhere that had a Chinese herbalist. All of those things were possible for medical care in 1918. Medical care was largely still delivered in the home, and medical degrees were extremely unregulated. The modern medical system that we have today has yet to come into existence when the flu hits in 1918. And what did the city of Bend look like? Well, here it is. This is Wall Street. This is the Liberty Theater right here. One of the few buildings in this picture that still exists today. Dirt sidewalks. Dirt roads. Here's the O'Kane building and the First National Bank building that's now gone, and US Bank is right here. The mills were the center of all economy. They were going strong. And this is a view from Pilot Butte. So a very small community. When the flu hits, the population of Bend is around 5,500 people. So tight-knit, very rural. Most people are working for the mills. You have people out in the logging camps surrounding town, and that will be another source of where the flu hits. So looking at the big picture, worldwide pandemic statistics, it's estimated, and it's just an estimation, that 40 to 50 million people were killed worldwide, that this pandemic wiped out a fifth of the world's population. Estimates range all the way up to 100 million. It's impossible for us to know. One of the things about this pandemic at the start of the 20th century, is that this is why we track diseases the way we do now. What happened in 1918 and 1919 made governments want to start keeping track, and eventually leads to the creation of the World Health Organization that we know today. No history, no disease in history, even the Black Plague, all of those large plagues that you can talk about in ancient history, nothing killed more people faster than the influenza strain did between January of 1918 and June of 1919. You have a very concentrated 1.5 year period for those 40 to 50 million people to die and succumb to the illness. It came in 3 waves. It started in spring of 1918, then fall and winter of 1918, and then again in spring of 1919. Fall of 1918, that second wave was the most deadly part of the disease, and that is when it hit Central Oregon. And in history books, it got referred to as the Spanish flu. And why is that? Well, one of the things about this moment in time is that we're engaged in World War I. And because Spain was not an active participant in World War I, and their reporting and press coverage was not fully about World War I, their medical community is the first to recognize and report in the press that there's something going on, there's something wrong, there's this virulent, deadly disease occurring. And so because it first is reported out of Spain, it mistakenly gets the misnomer of Spanish flu, when really they were just the first country to be talking about it. Like I said, World War I and the flu, you cannot separate these two things from one another in terms of history. World War I and the pandemic are completely intertwined. And that, the main reason is just the conditions of war between military encampments, troop movements, trench warfare that was just horrible in terms of hygiene. You cannot get worse than the trenches of World War I for just horrific conditions in terms of starvation, food, shortages, cleanliness, all of those things, prime breeding ground for spreading a virus around. As troops moved internationally, they're taking the virus with them. And in fact, one of the leading theories today is that the virus actually started in Kansas and is spread to Europe from American troops when we enter the war, and that we actually may have brought the flu to Europe. More enlisted men die of influenza than they do on the battlefield. But there is evidence that the flu reached highly remote areas of the world during the pandemic. So the virus does live on beyond the war, beyond troop movements and war zones. We know fully in 1918 that spitting, coughing, sneezing, we had learned from tuberculosis, actually, that that's how you spread this kind of disease. So this is 2 examples of national Red Cross on the left and just a political cartoon on the, not a political cartoon, a cartoon from the Public Health Service about how you protect people by not sneezing, not spitting, not coughing at them, cover your face, do your bit to protect me. So we know in 1918 how this is spread and work to try and prevent that. And one of the things that is a coincidence, timely coincidence between World War I and the flu was actually the development of the Red Cross. So the Red Cross was established in 1881, and they received an official congressional charter in 1900. They were all about first aid, water safety, public health programs prior to World War I, but they were very small still. And when World War I started, the need for international aid and healthcare and hygiene and public health, skyrocketed. And the number of local chapters in the United States jumped from 107 in 1914 at the start of World War I to 3,864 chapters by 1918. And membership had grown from 17,000 members to over 20 million adult members and 11 million junior Red Cross members. So what does that mean? It means that when the flu hits, the Red Cross is there and they're mobilized already for World War I. And so one of the things to think about reflecting back on this is, oh, thank goodness that the war had created this, immense system within the Red Cross to be able to help respond, because it could have been the public response to healthcare during the pandemic could have been so much worse if the Red Cross hadn't grown thanks to World War I. Here we have a map that shows the spread of the pandemic by date. So hopefully you can see on your screens, it's a little bit fuzzy. The slash marks over Oregon, that is the flu arriving between September 25th and October 5th. And we are completely in line with this map. So you can see the pockets along the East Coast and the West Coast where the first wave had come, and then how it moved around the country depending on how rural you were and as people traveled. How did the flu do in the United States specifically? Approximately 675,000 deaths in America between 1918 and June 1919. 25% of our population was affected. The first mass outbreak was reported in Boston. And again, back to that idea of we didn't report on these kinds of things the way we do after this pandemic. At the beginning of 1918, nobody was tracking the flu. It wasn't a reportable disease. So that makes it really difficult to track. And that's one of the reasons why whenever you talk about the flu pandemic, the numbers of people affected and the number of deaths is estimates. You know, we're doing our best to reconstruct the historical record to come up with these numbers, but because no one was reporting it, it makes it really difficult to track. This pandemic makes practitioners start reporting it voluntarily by late spring of 1918, trying to get ahead of that. So before they were even asking for the numbers, you know, practitioners were putting it there because it was so large. In the state of Oregon, there's 48,146 cases of the flu reported, and of those, there were 3,675 deaths between 1918 and 1920. Symptoms and characteristics. It resembled the common cold, which made it hard to diagnose and understand at first that this was a new strain, that something else was going on. Symptoms could include coughing, sneezing, headache, body ache, vomiting, diarrhea, exhaustion. All sounds a little bit familiar to what we're listening to today. With the fall resurgence in 1918, the flu by then, you were seeing a high fever, and that would come with the onset, something that is more commonly associated with the modern flu, but that was new to fall of 1918 to see this high fever come with it. Death was caused by the secondary pulmonary infections of the lungs, pneumonia, fluid filling the lungs. Again, sounds scarily familiar to today. These are the pieces that make us think about comparing COVID to this moment in time. But here's the piece that was very, very different. Death was highest among 20 to 40-year-olds, and the average age of deceased in the 1918-1919 flu pandemic were people in their mid-20s. They were people who seemed healthy and fit and not who you would think would succumb to the flu. And death came fast. It could come within 24 hours of the onset. So that was pretty terrifying. You would have, you know, healthy 20-year-olds drop dead in 24 to 48 hours of the flu. And that's shocking when that happens. How did you fight it? You quarantined. You had citywide closures, curfews for certain activities, schools, theaters, churches, any place where people congregated were put under forced shutdown. There were massive public awareness campaigns like that cartoon from the health department. You had cities that had to implement fines for people to enforce implementing the quarantines and closures. Part of the pandemic back then was that your public facilities that had been closed for different things like theaters and churches and stuff like that, they actually were converted to mass hospitals. We didn't have the hospital system that we have now, so you needed to take these larger buildings and turn them into mass hospitals. In Portland, streetcar windows were nailed open to make sure that fresh air circulated. And there was a healthy amount of denial. You did have people who insisted they just had the cold. It wasn't the flu. And that denial could be for a lot of reasons. One, it could be that you still needed to go to work. You didn't have the savings or the safety net to not go to work. And it was scary to admit that you had the flu. That's the other thing is it's not the flu, it's just a cold. Don't worry, not dead yet. So there was denial. There were people who didn't want to admit that this was happening and try to carry on like normal, even though that wasn't really possible. So there are remedies, but there are no cures. What were the remedies? Bed rest, bed rest, bed rest. Camphor oils, quinine, which was used to treat malaria. They attempted to use that. Common cold remedies, pneumonia jackets, which kind of helped, try and get your lungs breathing normally again. And frankly, whiskey and moonshine. Quackery abounded. There were all kinds of people who would try and sell you, the stereotypical snake oil for treatments. Fresh air was encouraged to keep your windows open in your homes and buildings for the health and for the healthy, being out in the fresh air as much as you possibly could to try and combat picking up the virus. By 1919, there are serums trying to be developed, which this is the antibody route of trying to create a vaccine. You had multiple universities and foundations around the country scrambling to try and come up with a way to battle this. There were 2 vaccines in the world at this point for rabies and for smallpox that had been developed really early on in the 19th century. So we understood the value of creating a vaccine and getting a vaccine made because of the success with smallpox and rabies. So some of those serums did get circulated around the United States. And here you see an ad for the Owl Pharmacy here in Bend advertising it, but there is no way really to go back and reconstruct if any of these early serums were successful when in a lot of the trials. So what does it look like here specifically when that wave comes in fall of 1918? Bend closed down from October 17th to December 13th. Remember, this is the second wave. So the newspaper has already been reporting about the first wave of the flu pandemic. City members have already lost family and friends to the flu in other parts of the world. Bend soldiers who were in military assignments around the world had succumbed to the flu, and that had been reported in the bulletin. So everyone by fall of 1918 knows this is a serious thing. So when the very first case is reported in the city of Bend, we're in lockdown. And that happens starting October 17th. Here you see, again, closing order now in effect. All meetings in the city included. Red Cross work closed this morning for an indefinite period. Other meetings are all postponed. And there you see the proclamation coming from Clyde McKay, who was serving as mayor pro tem at this point in time. Interestingly, Mayor Caldwell had taken a leave of absence as mayor to go to Portland and Vancouver area. He had steel welding skills and he wanted to support the war effort. So he had taken a leave of absence as mayor and gone to Portland to be working in the shipyards up in Portland and help the war effort. And unfortunately, he contracts the flu while he's there in the third wave and succumbs and dies of the flu in January of 1919, leaving the post permanently with Mr. McKay. So here's our proclamation. The necessity is urged upon everyone to avoid crowds, public assemblies, and shopping until the present epidemic has subsided. The hearty cooperation of everyone in this war measure will facilitate the lifting of this proclamation at an early date. This order becomes effective at 7 a.m. October 17th, 1918. So other ways that you battled it. This also looks very familiar. Gauze masks. How to make a gauze mask. This on the right is an image from the Bend Bulletin talking about how to make your mask. In many places, it became the law to wear a mask during the flu pandemic. And one of my favorite things is a little rhyme that developed at the time to remind everybody that went, obey the laws and wear the gauze. Protect your jaws from septic paws. P-A-W-S, pause. So everyone was on point to be wearing masks, much as we are today. This is an article from the Bend Bulletin. Unfortunately, it has the little tab in there, but teachers make gauze masks. So all of the teachers are off duty because the schools are closed. So here we have the account that teachers of the public schools of Bend who have been compelled to take a forced layoff on account of the closing order are making gauze masks at the Red Cross rooms in the Pringle building. Each school has been given a day on which the teachers are to report for work. Members of the high school corps are working today, and tomorrow will be given over to the teachers from Reed School. So they also made the rounds on a house-to-house canvas of the city, warning the children, warning their students to remain at home as much as possible and refrain from mingling with others on the streets. So everyone was taking this very, very seriously. And that volunteerism is going to be something that we come back to, that, you know, so the teachers were furloughed and not at home or not at work. They turned their efforts then towards how do we help fight the pandemic and take care of our community. And part of that is because we don't have the medical system in 1918 that we know today. This is the hospital that was in existence during the 1918 flu pandemic. It's alternately the Dr. Coe, Dr. Farrell, Dr. Van Evert hospital. Each of those three doctors owned and operated the hospital, worked there until it was turned over to the Sisters of St. Joseph. The hospital was opened in 1915, taken over by the Sisters of St. Joseph in 1916. There were 5 nuns on duty during the flu pandemic. Sadly, I don't have their names. And the Sisters of St. Joseph had come to Bend to take over healthcare here, and eventually they will open St. Charles Hospital in 1922 on the corner of Lava and Franklin, which becomes known then for decades as Hospital Hill. But at the time of the pandemic, you have just this one small hospital and 5 nuns. There's a dozen doctors in the area who are serving people. But again, medical care is largely given in the home, and the hospital is only for extreme need. And the little hospital, which by the way, I forgot to add, was located where about Pine Tavern is today. So on the banks of the river is where that hospital was, but not big enough for a pandemic. And that summer, the Bend Amateur Athletic Club had just finished constructing this grand building here on the corner of Wall Street and Idaho, right across the street from Reed School. And it had not even fully come into use as the Amateur Athletic Club when the flu pandemic hits. And it has a gymnasium, and it's the only spot in town that can really be turned into an emergency hospital. And so the Amateur Athletic Club turns it over to the city committee that was created to respond to the pandemic for use as the emergency hospital. Today, we know this as the Boys and Girls Club of Central Oregon, just down from the library. And this is a period shot of the gymnasium inside. So imagine this room strung with wires and bed sheets to hang down to create privacy spots and come up with 40 bed spaces that could be used for the flu pandemic. And they had petitioned the community for all of the supplies to be used at the emergency hospital: bed sheets, linens, anything that the community could donate, with the promise that they would be well sanitized before returned to them. Here's the list of the doctors that were working in the area at the time. Dr. Jim Donovan had moved out from the Midwest to Homestead, actually. He had a dream of no longer being a doctor and being a rancher, and found out that he wasn't a very good rancher. And then the flu pandemic hit, and he was tapped by the city to be the head of the emergency hospital, a job that he took on diligently. And Dr. John Vandevert was the city of Bend's health official at the time. So he had his own practice, but was also serving as the city of Bend's health official. You also had Dr. Bernard Farrell, Dr. Anna Rees Finley, Dr. Roy Hendershot, Dr. Hosh in Redmond, Dr. George Cousineau, Hiriam Dodds, and then in early 1919 on the tail end, you see the doctors listed there at the end who've moved to town, who helped fight the flu as it moves into 1919. Local statistics. Okay, so again, population is around 5,500 people. From mid-October until late November, a consistent number of 30 to 40 cases of flu are regularly reported and being monitored throughout the county. One of the best sources that we have for the flu for the flu pandemic is Dr. Donovan. According to him, 36 people died as a result of the flu, with the worst night coming November 14th with 4 deaths in one night at the emergency hospital. In total throughout the county, there's 44 deaths attributed to the flu during this period. Approximately 8 weeks goes by from the onset of the flu, that first case, until the closure order is lifted and schools reopen, so October 17th to December 12th. The emergency hospital at the athletic club ran from November 7th until December 5th. And one of the interesting things is that, again, with that experimentation in coming up with a serum and the lack of regulation, the head of our local Red Cross and the head of our emergency response committee, Alice Birdswell, she actually was able to obtain doses of an experimental serum from the Mayo Foundation, which we know today as the Mayo Clinic, and bring it to Bend. It's reported in the Oregonian that Bend has gotten this experimental serum to try before even Portland gets their hands on any. Excuse me, sorry. So we do get an experimental serum in town, but there are no records or no way for us to know if it produced any results or helped in any way. Excuse me, sorry. So here we have Dr. John Vandivert's passport photo. And next to him is his sister, Catherine Grace. This is one of those deaths that I talked about, you know, being in your 20s and it could be shocking. So Catherine Grace Vandivert was only 28 years old when the flu came that fall. She had been a school teacher. She was single. She had recently taken on a job with the post office. She was extraordinarily well liked. She was a magnanimous, very happy, outgoing individual whom many people loved and held her in high regard. And at 28, in that first week of November, she was stricken with the flu and died in that very first week. So one of the things that I always think about with Dr. Vandivert was, here he was on the front lines, and in the very first week, the worst week of the whole thing, he loses his sister and has to carry on and move forward with trying to help the rest of the community. Catherine's buried out at Vandivert Ranch near Sun River, but also there is a memorial window in the stained glass windows of the Methodist Church on Bond Street that was dedicated specifically to her. Again, volunteerism was critical. So one of the questions that I get asked about this time period was, you know, how did the medical community stay protected? Well, again, there were only 5 nuns and, you know, the dozen or so doctors. All of the orderlies, all of the nursing, all of the people that you would encounter when you came to the emergency hospital for treatment, they were all just your community neighbors. They were volunteers, they were the teachers, they were folks who wanted to help get our community past this. So 2 people in particular. One, all of the people on the Red Cross committee were all volunteers. Klondike Kate is seen here on the left of your screen. She made a name for herself during the flu pandemic because she was willing to go into people's homes. So if someone was at home convalescing with the flu and needed supplies, needed food, needed, you know, some of the drugs that they were trying to use just for relief of symptoms, Kate was willing to go to people's homes and risk exposure to bring people what they needed. On the right is Robert Sawyer, who, this is him later in life. He was younger when the flu pandemic hit, and he was just about ready to take over ownership and editorial rights to the Bend Bulletin from George Palmer Putnam, where he would be with the Bulletin for years. He worked a shift nearly every day as an orderly in the emergency hospital. And this is Arthur Pringle, who had a car, and Arthur was willing to take doctors and supplies to people who were not in Bend. So if they were in the logging camps and someone needed brought into the emergency hospital, or if someone were in Lapine or Redmond and needed something, Arthur was willing to be the one to grab his car and take it. And one of the, if there's light notes in this story of, mortality, it was Arthur that the newspaper reported that he made 2 record runs in time with his car. One of them was that he went to Lapine to take medicine to the home of E.L. Clark, where both Mr. and Mrs. Clark were seriously ill. He made the round trip from Bend to Lapine in 2 hours and 17 minutes of drive time, which was the fastest that anyone had driven between Bend and Lapine at the time, the distance of 36 miles. And then he also made a record trip to the Caldwell Ranch at Paulina Prairie, making that in 35 minutes, a distance of 27 miles. So again, volunteerism made a lot of this care possible. And then the ban is lifted in December. And this is one of the things that there's a couple words in here that when we talk about why are we shutting down and do we need to be shut down and how do we enforce this and, the rights of citizens under these kinds of situations, quarantine was our only line of defense, really for centuries. We didn't have the modern medical system that we have now. So if you ask the question about did people fight against this, the answer is not really, because that was the only way to fight it. We weren't used to having vaccines. We weren't used to having cures. The only way to stay safe was to stay home and follow the quarantine rules. And this is what was run in the paper when the ban had been lifted. You'll see it starts with the word warning, though. Not celebratory, yay, we're lifting the ban. It's warning, we're lifting the ban. Acting upon the recommendation of the Special Influenza Committee, we are withdrawing the closing proclamation issued October 17th. The council disclaims any responsibility for the results of the opening, and the public is hereby notified that people attending public gatherings do so at their own risk, and they are urged to take the utmost precautions in order that this dread disease may be stamped out as soon as possible. So there's liability here, right? That, we have to protect ourselves on that front as well as just the disease front of, okay, you said we could go out. Well, that didn't necessarily mean that influenza was gone. And the other question, we get asked about this is, what did everybody do? So how did we return life to normal? Mostly. Here we see in December that a New Year's Eve dance is going to mark the reopening of the athletic club and its return to its normal use after being, the scene of the emergency hospital, which, by the way, one of the reasons why this, the mortality of this was so present, it was not uncommon for them to set the deceased just out behind the building and so to be picked up by the undertaker. So it was entirely possible that people could walk by and see the deceased behind the building waiting to be picked up. So this is a grim moment in time, and people took it seriously. In the middle there, December 12th, 1918, how did school get started up again and how did you catch up? This is an article talking about the fact that school will be in session on Saturdays. We'll have to do some Saturdays to get the students caught up to where they needed to be. And just monitoring the flu and how people kept thinking about it. Again, this continues into 1919. It continues on to this day. We know that we have bouts with the flu every year and that we lose people every year still to influenza. So that last article there is you can't catch real flu twice as people are trying to understand, can I get this again and how does this really work? And in February of 1920, actually, the city quarantined itself for 3 weeks because of a double outbreak of smallpox and the flu. So again, prior to about the mid-20th century, around the polio epidemics, people were used to quarantining. They were still used to closing things down for periods of time to protect themselves from disease. It's something that we actually have just gotten out of the habit of having to do. And that's where comparing the flu of 1918 to COVID is a little bit apples and oranges. You really never can compare the two. Much of what we know about pandemics came from this 1918-1919 pandemic, and how you fight them, what's successful, what works, what doesn't. Those are the lessons from history. It feels very similar. It feels like history is repeating itself, but history is never truly repeating itself because the factors at play will never be exactly the same. We today have modern hospitals, we have ventilators, all of those things are so completely removed and different from 1918 that you can't accurately compare the two. This pandemic in 1918, like I said, gave us the value of tracking and gave us so much science that we move forward with today. And so many of the steps that we're taking today were because of what we lived through the hard way in 1918, when we lost, 675,000 Americans in a year and a half to a disease, and 40 to 50 million people worldwide. That teaches you a few things. While wearing masks and quarantines feels foreign to us today, it's because modern medicine and vaccinations have made us forget that we needed to do those things, and that they used to be really our only line of defense. And the role of modern medicine and our expectations are really what's profoundly different from 2020 and 1918. In 1918, medical care was there to try and make you comfortable, try and get you through the disease and minimize your symptoms, but there was no cure, and everyone knew that. And unless you got really, really, really ill, you were probably still at home. There were no ventilators. There wasn't the concept that you would go to a hospital where you could convalesce for 40 or 50 days if needed and have a respirator breathing for you. So those expectations of how our healthcare system can respond for us is one of the things that's monumentally different between 1918 and 2020 today. So that's my talk. It was not a fun moment in time. It was scary, but when you listen to, actually, I forgot to put up this slide. When you listen to Dr. Donovan, I encourage you to go to the library, get your library card out, and find the 15-minute histories, because we actually have an oral history from 1953 with Dr. Donovan, and he talks about living through this experience. And he is, over and over, he talked about this and wrote about this, that it was heartwarming, that the way the community rallied and pulled together was unlike anything he had ever experienced. And so even though the mortality was scary and terrifying, how the community rallied and responded and took care of one another is really what stuck with him. So find the 15-minute histories in the e-catalog of the Deschutes Public Library. Have a listen, because it's great. And now I'm seeing just these horrible typos in my top slide there for 2 book recommendations. Wow, I apparently had not had enough coffee when I typed this up. Pandemic 1918 by Catherine Arnold, and The Great Influenza by John Barry. Woof, sorry about that. Way to end on some typos, Kelly.
So just a couple of thoughts that have come up for me, Kelly, while I was listening to your presentation. There's so much in the news and the science, and trying to understand it, for me as a person, trying to understand the science is a heavy lift. And that's why I think it's so important to hear about these are personal stories, and it helps me, it really helped me to contextualize what happened and what we learned.
Yeah. When you listen to Dr. Donovan, one of the things he talks about is going to a boarding house and picking up, I think he calls him a young, healthy Swede who was a logger, from Sweden, an immigrant. And he died on the steps of the athletic club. They didn't even get him in. That's, so again, the idea that it was just wiping out these healthy 20-year-olds in front of everyone so quickly, that you take that seriously, right? That nobody was messing around with that.
Yeah, and I do think it's interesting that the advances that we've made medically and in science have somehow set us up to suffer again, because we are, you know, we feel like we're immune to it. We feel like we have all the answers, and we don't.
Well, and actually, interestingly, the other disease and series of epidemics that COVID is getting compared to right now, and that historians are out talking about, is polio. And the interesting thing with polio in the early 20th century is that it might be that our development of sewer systems and improving our hygiene around sewer systems made us less protected. Our own immune systems were lowered, our defenses were lowered for the virus that causes polio. And so because our cleanliness and hygiene around sewer systems got better, our resistance lowered, and then that brought on these new epidemics of polio. And when you look at the newspapers from the 20s all the way to the 1950s, you see all of these editorials and articles about polio season. And so it would come on in the summer, it would come on every year. It was an annual thing, and there were always the reminders to wash your hands. Again, feeling very familiar. Make sure you're washing your hands, don't touch your face. How would you protect your children? Because polio struck children at a higher rate than it did adults. And so how do you protect your kids? And it was believed for a long time that water carried polio around. And so it was not uncommon at all for there to be a polio outbreak, and you would close all the beaches and you would close all the pools so that you kept the children from going and swimming and being together and spreading polio. And it really, the development of the polio vaccine, you're right. You know, when does modern medicine make us feel relaxed about something and give you that we've got this protection now? And you know, the success of polio and those vaccines, and then measles and mumps and whooping cough makes, you know, does give you this sense of, you know, we'll be okay, we'll be taken care of. And so to have the medical community look at everyone in 2020 and say, no, this has us beat, and we're going to struggle to take care of you if you all get sick, that is fundamentally different from all of these previous pandemics.
Yeah, really interesting stuff. So just for anybody else that's interested, in addition to Kelly's suggested reading list, there is a ton of pandemic fiction out there, which I highly recommend. Maybe not now, maybe later.
When it feels a little less close.
Yeah, give it a little time. But of course, you can find all those at the Deschutes Public Library. I think there's a pandemic reading list right now up on the website. Nice. So
I like Year of Wonder. What's your favorite?
Oh, I love Year of Wonder. My favorite is by an author named Thomas Mullen called Last Town on Earth. And it is about the 1918 pandemic. The main character, they live up in Washington, it takes place up in Washington, and a small town decides to quarantine itself to prevent they're not letting anybody in, they're not letting anybody out. But of course, somebody gets in, and it's a great book about, it really questions, you know, what you're willing to do for your community, even as you put your own self at risk. Yeah. Really great book. But Year of Wonders is absolutely great.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing, is that sometimes, you know, history can show us inspiring things as well as the scary.
Indeed. I love history. Kelly, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I know people are really going to find this interesting. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks, Liz.